Alrighty. The next steps I will do first, afterwards we will do them together. I want to now fill the holes in here, and for this, in order to see that this thing rotates in the end, I want to add another hole. So if we look at the After Effects thing, we can see how there's another hole here, and I just do the same thing as I did before. So I have my cylinder here, then, what was this? I have my cylinder here, I duplicate it, then I use a bool, drop both cylinders inside, make this one a bit larger and smaller, make sure it's the second one, and I move it into place, something like this. Now, when I take a look at my rotating with lines, I can see that this does not generate nice geometry here. So I will select the first cylinder, go to the caps, and I have segments for the caps that I can increase, and therefore get a much nicer regular grid here. Alrighty, next, let me go to the regular garage shading again. And I want to rotate this. But if I rotate it, I have this issue if I drop it into a cloner, that the cloner overrides my rotation. So here, I could tell this one to be rotated like this, but if I enable the cloner, that rotation is gone. So apparently, this does not work. I also know that the bool might be a performance killer. So I will take the bool, I will create a copy of it. Then I merge it together. I can take the cylinders, merge them together as well, and now I have a child. The cloner only fixes the actual clone, but not the children of it. So I am now able to create a cloner, drop this inside, and tell this cylinder to be rotated in a weird way. Of course, it should not be in a weird way. So I select the cylinder at the beginning of the timeline, I go to the coordinates, and it's the H rotation that I want to animate. I activate the stopwatch, go to the end, change the value to 360, create another keyframe there. So when I play this back, it does this. Obviously, this should be a continuous rotation. So I select each keyframe and change the interpolation to linear. So I have an even, seamless animation going on. Then I can tell the cloner to be not cloning it upwards, but cloning it along the x-axis by 200. Like this. And then I just see how many clones I need. Apparently 20. However, every object is now doing the same thing, but here we can see how they are doing it somewhat differently. There, I was very lazy. I just duplicated the bool that I have here, selected the cylinder, went to the coordinates, and flipped it along one axis. I don't remember which one. Maybe the z-axis. Not the z-axis. The x-axis? Here we go. So by flipping this, the rotation behaves differently as well, and I end up with this counter animation. Okay, let's get to this together. We take a closer look at our cylinder that we have here. We know that we need a bool, so let's create this one already. We can then drop this cylinder into the bool, and we can then create a copy of the cylinder. We created a bool. We have a cylinder lying around down here above the backup. We drop it into the bool, and then we duplicate the cylinder. Then we take the cylinder at the bottom. We make it a little bit higher. and we scale it down. Then we can move it to one of the sides. Which one doesn't really matter. It disappears because they have the same size. As soon as you make it higher and then scale it down, you make it higher by hovering over the hotspot here in the middle.
The whole the big circle disappeared.
Mm.
It's inverted. The small one disappeared and the big one disappeared.
Next, we want to make sure that we have a backup of the bool just in case. Oh no, one more thing. Let's check our geometry. So we go to the garage shading and we realize that our geometry sucks. The geometry that we see here is our first object, so the object A. We select the cylinder.1, go to the caps, and then we increase the segments. Right now they're set to 1. And then we just increase them until we have a nicer, more even grid. Well, 20, 30, something like that. Good. Now that the geometry is clean, we can create a backup of this. So we take the bool, hold on the Control key, and drop it into our backups folder. We know that this is just hiding things, so we want to disable these objects as well. Then we go to the bool that we have in the top, and we make it editable by hitting the letter C. We open up the null, and we want to merge the two cylinders together. So just like earlier, we select both, right-click on them, and we choose Connect Objects plus Delete. So far, so good. Next, we want to clone them. So we go to MoGraph, create a cloner, and drop it into the cloner. We go to the settings of the cloner, change the y-axis to 0, and the x position to 200. We can also go back to our display and change it to garage shading again. Then we increase the count of the clones until we have enough clones that it fills our range here. 20. So far, so good? Alrighty. Next, we want to animate this. So we select the cylinder that is inside of the bool. We go to the beginning of the timeline, and we go to the coordinates. Here, we create a keyframe for the H rotation.
My cloner, my cylinder, by the end, the 20s, it's shifting.
Okay. So we had the cylinder.2, we are at the beginning of the timeline, and we activated the keyframe button for the H. Then we go to the end of our animation, so frame 100, and we change the H rotation to 360. Then we confirm this by clicking on the keyframe button again. If we now scrub through, we should see how all of these clones are rotating around. So far, so good? They are, however, rotating around in an east kind of fashion, which means we want to select each of the keyframes. Let's start with the end one. And we change the interpolation from spline to linear. Then we go to the first keyframe, click it, and change it from spline to linear. Then we can duplicate our bool. Hold down the Control key and drag it upwards. In the duplicated bool, we select the cylinder dot 2, go to the coordinates, and give it a negative size for the x-axis. If we now play this back, we should have this offset in the rotation.
For x-axis?
Mm-hmm.
And the scale?
Scale x -1.
Scale -1? No.
Alrighty. Next. Okay. Next, we want to, or I will do the next steps first. Afterwards, we do them together. I want to create my camera and the animation of the plane. First, I want to make sure that the plane and the linear field are nicely centered. So sometimes when you select the plane and you move it around, you're actually not moving the plane, but only the linear field. Not quite sure why this happens. It's super annoying. So first, I want to zero everything out. I select the linear field, and I change the position to 0. I select the plane, really the plane. So you can see if I click it once, both are highlighted. If I click it a second time, the top one is highlighted. So the plane, I make sure it's at 0 as well. So everything is down here in the beginning. Then I drop it all the way to the top, create a null object, and drop the plane into the null. Now I have the null that I can move, and I can also place a camera into that null. So I can adjust my camera angle to something like this. And when I take the null and I move it, the camera is moving along with it. So here I started at whatever, some value that I can remember. Maybe 2,500 seems to be a good value. I don't see the end, I don't see the beginning, all is fine. Hmm?
You do see the beginning.
No. It's pretty far away. I activate my keyframe here. I go to the end of my animation, and now I need to move it by how many centimeters? So I move it here, but by how much to get a seamless animation? There are only two values that can come into your mind. What? What did you say? 1 what?
1920.
190 what?
But that would be pixels.
No.
So what's the first value that you put? 2500.
That doesn't matter.
Okay.
I'm thinking about what is the amount that I need to move. So if I look at it like this, and my center is here, in the center of this, then I move the camera to here, but this looks different because this one and this one is different. And these two are 200 centimeters apart. So apparently I need to go from this one to this one because these two here are the same. So it's 400. See, this wasn't so hard. I go into my camera and I need to move this. So here's where I started at 2500. Then I go down and I realize, okay, so I need to go into a negative direction. So I go to 500, negative 400, so 2100. And I activate the keyframe button here. So now this frame and this frame are identical. And when I play back, I have all my animation in between. But the first and the last step are exactly the same. Now this, of course, also needs to be linear. So I select the keyframe, set it to linear, the first one as well, set it to linear. And if I now play it back, I have an almost seamless animation. I only have a little bit of hiccup because the first and the last frame are identical. So I have two frames that are duplicated. I could, however, just shorten my animation by one frame. Then I have my seamless animation here. I just have a tiny bit of a hiccup when Cinema needs to reset the entire scene. So depending on your computer, you might see this hiccup stronger or less strong. On my computer, you can hardly see it. It's just a very small hiccup. In the final render, of course, this will not happen. It's just here when someone needs to reset the scene and go back to the beginning. Let's do this together. We start by making sure that our plane effector and the field inside of the plane effector are both at 0. So let's open this up, select the linear field, and in the linear field, we want to change the x position to 0. So we open up the plane effector, select the linear field, and we change the x position to 0. Then we select the plane effector. Then we realize it selects the linear field again. So we select the plane effector a second time to make sure that only the plane effector is highlighted in the bright orange. And we double check that our position is zeroed out. So far, so good. Then we create a null object. We drop the plane into the null. Then we create a camera. We drop the camera into the null and we look through the camera. When we look through it, we can adjust our angle of the camera to roughly the angle that we want. Because we are not animating the camera, we are animating the null object, we can change the angle of the camera anytime we want. We will always have a perfect seamless loop. So far, so good. If we now select the null object, we should see it somewhere on our screen. And you hover over the x-axis, you should see how you can now move through our animation like this.
What did we move now?
The null object.
Can you move yours again, please? It's one by one bar.
It depends a little bit on how large your linear field is. So if the linear field is very short, and we move the null, then it's 1 by 1 by 1. If the linear field is longer, then it is a smoother overlap of the separate animations. Alrighty, next, we want to create the animation for the camera. So first, we move the null object to a place where we want to start. So somewhere like here, for instance. I take a look at my x position, and maybe I take around a value like, in this case, 2,200, just so it's something that I can calculate with easier. Then we go to the first frame of our scene, and we activate the keyframe stopwatch. Then we go to the end of the animation, and we need to figure out if it should go into a positive or a negative direction.
Are we in the camera or are we on the
We are in the camera, and we have the null object selected.
when I'm in the camera and I'm
Next, we go to the end of our animation, and we figure out if we should go into a positive or a negative direction. So we just click and drag this value, and I can see apparently it should move downwards, so a negative. If I cannot calculate this by head, I could also, if this is back to, I can just reset it by moving around here. I can click in here and type in negative 400. Hit enter and save this value. If we now jump from the first to the last frame, our geometry should always be identical. So far, so good? Then, to make sure that we have a seamless, continuous loop, this animation of the null object needs to be linear. So we select the keyframe, and we change the interpolation to linear. We do the same with the first keyframe as well. If we now play it back, it might not play back in real time, but we should have a seamless loop with just a tiny hiccup in the end because of the reverting of the timeline and the two duplicate frames. Good. Okay, so now that this animation is done, let me show you the rest of the setup. I will go through it fairly quickly, I think. Let me save. One very nice thing about this is that we did not animate the camera, which means we can at any point choose a different camera angle, and we still have a perfectly seamless loop. So we animated the null object. Our scene and the animation of the null is seamless. So now, well, of course, there's still a slight difference here because I'm further away, so I have this additional clone there. But if I work with motion blur and a little bit of tricks in the back, I would not see it. Or I just choose a camera angle where I don't see the end, and then all is good. So I can just do whatever I want with the camera, and I will always have, from every angle, a seamless loop. So that is pretty cool. Speaking of the camera, there's one thing that I want to change. I feel like I don't get the angle that I want without seeing the edges of my scene, and that's something I don't want. So I want to use a camera that is a little bit more zoomed in. For this, I change the focal length. And I don't have to use a 36 millimeter. I can use, for instance, a portrait, actually 80 millimeter. So I choose this, and now I can see how it feels like it's zoomed in a lot more, and I can see more of my transition and less of the edges in the background. So this is the look that I'm going for. Next, I want to create a floor. This floor, however, if I go outside of the camera, is too short. My scene is a lot larger than this. A floor in the end is infinite. So when I create a sky and I render this, I see the floor goes all the way across, just not in the preview here. I can fix this, though, by selecting the floor, going to the object mode and scaling it up. In the object mode, I can scale it up, so I can see it in the editor here a little bit larger as well. It doesn't affect the render at all, though. Then I want to add a light. For this, I will use, not a regular light, I will use an area light. The area light should always be targeted to the plane effector. I drop the light into the null object, and I move it around. Then I change the things that I always change about a light. I turn on the area shadows. I might make it a little bit larger so I get some nice soft shadows. I will go to my options and I enable the shadows here as well. So I can see as I move the light around what the angle, what the angle of the shadows being cast will be. So something like this looks like it can be cool, and I render it to see what it looks like. So far, so good. Now I also know that I prefer it when my light has this fall off. So I go to the details, go to the fall off, and choose inverse square physically accurate. Now in this scenario, because I will not use materials that are reflective, I can use the fall off to define how bright my light should be. So I can make it a lot larger than the base is. So something like this. Now the important part is that the light sits in the null object, so it moves along, so you don't make the same mistake that I did. Then I will apply my different materials. For this, I also used something from Adobe Color. I don't have it open anymore. Oh, over there. Let's just use something else. I have an orange here. I don't use reflectance so that it renders a little bit faster and I have a smooth, soft look. This I apply it to my cloners. Oops. These ones here. Then let's just go for the blue color. The blue color for the floor. Yeah. Floor. And maybe I make my sky not as bright, so I create a new material, just the luminance, and I change it to maybe 50%. Then, just to have the most control over everything, I create the 80% gray material, and I apply it to the cloner with my eyes that I have here. So when I now render, I can see, okay, so with these colors, it starts to look a little bit overexposed. So apparently I need to make the light overall a little bit darker. So I change the fall off here, make it smaller. It might look a little bit dark here, but once I render, everything gets a whole lot brighter because of the sky that adds additional light due to the GI. All right, so this looks pretty okay. Maybe it needs to be a slightly bit darker again. But I see that I do have a little bit of an issue. This looks a whole lot thicker than this.
The floor is it's not on the light.
Because our objects are centered on the world, and the floor is as well, so the floor is in between.
Need to go down to 0.5?
Exactly. So these objects here are 5 centimeters high, which means the floor needs to be moved down by -2.5. And then everything sits exactly on the floor. And then the setup for this is basically done. Let's get to this point together. We start by creating a floor. We then realize that the floor is not large enough. We don't want to mess our camera that we have right now, so we go outside of the camera. With the floor selected, we need to switch from the model mode to the object mode. Then we can use the scale tool and scale the floor up until it covers our entire scene. Good. Then we will create a little bit of a light setup. For this, let's create a sky.
Did we change the focal length of the camera?
Now we can do that later as well. We create a sky, and now when we hit Command R, we should already see something being rendered and some smooth shadows all the way around. So far so good. Next, we want to create our light. So we choose an area light. The area light should be parented in the null object as well, so right next to our camera. Then we right-click on the area light and add a target tag. Cinema 4D tags, target tag on the light. Then, on the area light, we go to the general settings and turn on the area shadows.
And how do we define the target?
On the target tag, oh yeah, sorry. We drag in the plane effector into the target object field.
The floor. Did we create a floor or a plane?
A floor.
But with the plane or the floor?
Neither. The plane effector. Sorry.
Regarding the target part again? Okay.
So in here, we have the target object, and you drag the plane effector into the target object field. Good.
So that the light moves with the plane?
No, so that the light always looks at the plane effector. It moves with it because it's parented to the null, and the null is animated.
Okay. Why would this?
Why we use the target?
Yeah, it's already moving with the null. So what?
The target has nothing to do with the position. The target only has to do with the rotation. So as I move this around, the light is always pointing at it. If I don't have the target tag, it's just moving around like this.
It will be moved with the null.
The target tag is only there so that the light source always points at a specific area, which makes it a lot easier for us to adjust the position. Because if I render it right now, maybe without the sky, you can see how it creates this additional black line here.
We won't see all of that because we already use the camera. Right?
But we might see it if this light is not looking at the object. So we can place it here, and it might feel like the light is kind of like where it should be. But as soon as we render it, we can see how we get this black line here, because the light is not looking
My idea
at the object.
The light, I thought it's like a circle. So it's going through air 360.
Nope.
Not
An
flat.
area light is like a softbox, but with the difference that it shines in two directions. So we get this weird edge here. Good. So a light, especially an area light, should always be targeted at something. It makes it a whole lot easier to adjust the position of it. Also, when we move it, it just focuses always on the object, so even when I move it, it's easier to control. So I place it somewhere like this. In order to see the shadows, to get a better feeling of where the light is, we also need to enable shadows for the editor by going to Options and enabling Shadows. And then we get a preview of the shadows.
Can you repeat the last step?
Go to Options, enable Shadows.
We didn't change anything in the light settings, right? Yeah.
Well, we turned the
shadows, yeah.
shadow on. That's all we did so far. Then, we might want to make the light a little bit larger, because when I render, the shadows are kind of sharp, and I want them to be super, super soft and undefined. So, with the light selected, we hit T for the scale tool and just scale it up. Before we do this though, I recommend using the model mode again. So the object mode should only be used when we know that we want to change the scale of the coordinates, like we did on the floor. So changing back to the model mode and scaling this up. When we render again, we should have a much softer, more undefined shadow. So far, so good. Next, we know that a light looks better when it has a physically accurate fall-off. So we go to the details and change the fall-off from none to inverse square, physically accurate. Details, fall-off, inverse square, physically accurate. Now, before we adjust the size of the fall-off, we might want to add our materials and see how the colors of the final materials are behaving together with the light. So let's create a new material and turn off the reflectance. For the look that I want it to be very soft and matte. So I only work with a color. And I will just use the same colors from the Adobe theme here. This we then apply to the first two cloners that we have created, so the two ones that contain our plain cubes with the hole.
On the cloner 2 or 1?
So cloner and cloner.1. Then we duplicate the material, choose another color, and we apply this one to the floor. Yet another material with more of a neutral color. And 80% gray should be fine.
The gray is
for the cloner.2, which is for our eyes.
And what's the color for the sky?
That is the next material.
The gray, 80 or which one?
Yeah, 80%.
As it is, okay. 2,
The last material,
cloner 2. Okay.
The last material has no reflectance, no color, just luminance, and I would go to 50% of the brightness. And this is the material that we apply to the sky. Now we have our final GI setup, our final materials, and we can see if we might want to change something in the light source here as well. But so far I think it actually looks nice. From afar it might look a little bit too intense, but if I look through the camera just at the area that I want to render later on, I think this looks fine.
There should be contrast between both of them, right? I mean,
Between both of what?
between the sheets and
The floor.
right?
Well, I have two different colors, so there is a contrast. Yeah.
Overall, direction-wise.
Well, that's up to you. You can also use a different thing. I just used a darker color here, also so that we get these black dots in the eyes to get more of this eye feeling.
If it's too dark, then we can just increase the fall-off.
Exactly. If it's too dark, you can increase the fall off, or you can go to the light and change the intensity. Both ways work.
And we change the camera focal length also, right?
Now that everything is pretty much final, we can fine-tune this by going to the camera, to the physical, to the object tab, and change the focal length to something like a portrait lens of 88 millimeters. Of course, we need to adjust our position a little bit.
88?
80. Just portrait. There are presets on the right.
We go to camera, then
Object,
object,
and then the focal length, change the preset to portrait. Good.
And then for the sky, did we change the brightness or?
We created a material and the luminance is 50%.
So do we change the brightness or the black and white scale? Which is the.
Doesn't matter, in the end it's the same end result.
Okay.
Of course, if you do both of them, then you get 25%. Alrighty.
These are 80%.
Now let me show you the last steps. Oh no, one more thing for this to be pretty much finished. The floor, we go to the coordinates and we change the y position to -2.5. Now we're done. Okay, so I have added one more thing to this before I rendered this out, and that was adding a multipass. We already know that we can use multipasses to create masks by using object buffers. There are, however, many different types of multipasses here. One of them is called a depth pass. Let me show you what a depth pass generates. If I go back to After Effects here, you can see how I rendered out two sequences, the regular sequence and a depth sequence. If I open this up in a new composition, the depth sequence represents the depth of my scene. Black means it's further away, and white means it's closer to me. This can then be used for all sorts of effects. The main thing that this is usually used for is adding a depth of field effect. I will show you how this works. However, the default plugin for After Effects doesn't do it very well. We get some artifacts. There are other plugins that handle it a little bit better. But just to show you how this would work, I could add an adjustment layer, Command-Alt-Y, and I can add the camera lens blur to this. In the camera lens blur, I can define what the layer is, so the fit map. Then I can increase the blur radius, and I can see how it blurs something. In the back, everything is sharp, and the more I go to the front, the more it gets blurred. I can change this by going to the blur focal distance and increasing this. Now, my focus is a little bit more towards the front. So let me increase this further to something like this. So now, this area here is sharp, the back is blurred, and the front is blurred as well. So with this, we can control depth of field and render it directly in After Effects. The disadvantage here is, if we only do it a little bit, it works kind of fine, but if I do it super intense, I start to see weird artifacts, plus it takes quite a long while to render. So here I can see, if I zoom in, it starts to show me some edges where it should be blurred, and vice versa. So it doesn't work as good as we might want it to be. If it's just a small depth of field effect, it's fine, we can do it in After Effects, but otherwise we want to render it in Cinema 4D. How to render depth of field in Cinema 4D is something we talk about in another session. There is another way that this can be used for. I like to use it to add a little bit of a color depth to my scene. For this, I first increase the contrast of this. So I go to the levels, I take a look at the levels, and I push it to the extremes. So I get the entire range of this map, like this. By the way, this could also be used together with a displacement. I could use it together with a displacement, and if I change it on the horizontal axis, we can see how it's almost giving us a little bit of a 3D-ish effect. But, of course, there's no masks, there's nothing that it could reveal, so if we do it only slightly, it is a fun effect to use to add a little bit of 3D-ness to this, but anyways, what I want to use it for is as a mask. I create an adjustment layer, Command-Alt-Y, and I add some curves to this. In the curves, I will push my blacks quite a bit and make it a bit brighter, and maybe I push in even more of a blue color to get this feeling like there's some fog on top of everything. Then I will go to my modes and I use a Luma matte, or actually in this case, the Luma matte inverted. So now it's only applied to the back with a nice gradation. So things in the front are untouched, and the more we go to the back, the more I get this depth feeling. So this is a very nice effect of adding some depth to the render if this looks too flat and you feel like you would like to see a little bit more of the 3D-ness of the entire scene. And here we see how we have a nice big difference between elements that are in the front and elements that are in the back. How do we create this? In the camera itself, we need to define where is the point that is in the back and where is the point that is in the front. So what is the range of our depth? I will go outside of the camera, and I need to define the far point by defining where the focus of the camera is. So this should be all the way down here so that the entire scene is covered. I don't want it to be too short. If it looks like, where's the second point here? If it looks like this, then I would only get a depth area up here, but not for the back. So I want to make sure that it goes all the way down to the floor. This is where the end is. Now I need to define where the beginning is. And I do that by going to the details and telling it where the front blur is. And this is this one here. So here I want to make sure I don't drag it too far out, but it should easily cover everything that comes in. This should work kind of fine, maybe a little bit more room. Doesn't hurt. And now, when I've defined it as a multipass, I enable multipass, and I fix my render settings, render out a PNG. I am good to go, and I can render out my depth path for this. Of course, I should not forget to go back into my camera before I start the rendering, and in my render settings under output, I want to define that it should be all frames, and then I subtract 1. And that is it. Are there questions? Good. Then, let me give you your face-to-face assignment. I want you to create something like this. This is the minimum complexity. It should be something that loops, because we know that render times can explode. A still image can take something between 5 minutes and 5 hours, and if you have to render out 4 seconds, then you have 100 times the render times. So we want to keep this, the rendering itself, kind of simple. The animation itself should be complex, but the textures can be simpler to make sure that the render times are okay. The length of the animation is kind of up to you. It should be between 2 and 4 seconds, but because 2 and 4 seconds are kind of lame, you should loop it. If the animation is interesting enough, a ping pong loop is fine as well. But you get plus points for a seamless loop like this.
But it won't be a problem if you rendered this and duplicated it on After Effects.
No, exactly.
Right.
That's what the loop is for. So you only need to render out these 100 frames, then you can put it in After Effects and loop it 5 times. Yeah. So in the end, we have a video where we can look at the loop multiple times. How to create that a little bit more in detail, we will talk about it towards the end of the quarter. But what you should already start thinking about is, what is the animation that you want to do? And this is also your homework for next week. I want you to create some options of what you want to create. It can be fairly abstract like this. It could also be something that is a little bit more concrete if you want to. So by next session, I want 2 to 3 examples of what you can think of, what you might want to do. There are a whole lot of loops in this area online. Of course, you can also look at some for inspiration, but I don't want you to copy something. You can be inspired by something. This one here was also inspired by, I guess you know the McMuffin video thing. But it's slightly different, and it was just for the purpose of showing you how certain things work. You, of course, should do something that is a little bit more your own. Does it make sense so far? So for next time, I want you to have 2 to 3 examples of what you want to do. It can be a scribble that you did, where you say, like, these are the elements that you want, or it can be something where you already started building something in Cinema. You don't have to know exactly how to do it yet. But like, I want, like, here's some things that should be arranged like this, and then I want certain things to happen like that. So it doesn't have to be executed or finished, but just so that you have something with which you can explain what you plan to do. So we can start already brainstorming, and I can teach you certain things so you can finish your face-to-face a little bit better. In the next sessions, we will then also focus about how we can connect our machines together so that we can do a team rendering, which means one machine is the master and the other ones are the slaves, and just render for the master. So you can help each other out later on. You get the face-to-face assignment this early because, well, the render time might take a little bit longer, and it might also take a little bit of time to get the animation right and have it looping. And maybe the first thing that you do might not be the thing that you render out. Maybe you build something and then you're like, oh, maybe this is lame, and then you try another time. So you should at least reserve the last 2 weeks before the face-to-face for the rendering, and maybe after you rendered it once, you might realize something like I did, where you forgot the light and then the loop is not seamless and you need to render it a second time. So 2 weeks before should be a place where you start your first finished render. Maybe you're done by then already, or maybe you want to refine stuff. Also, towards the end of the quarter, when you have to do the other face-to-faces, you don't have the luxury to have your computer running at 100% for 2 days. So plan this in. Of course, towards the end of the quarter, we will still learn new things, but I don't expect those things that we learn new to be in the face-to-face. So the face-to-face is kind of like based on what we know so far and what we learn in like the next session and the one afterwards, and then the additional things that we learn do not have to be included in there. Make sense? Next week, just to push you guys, I will also show you what the last advanced quarter did in Hamburg and Berlin, because they did some pretty cool stuff. And then you can be like, damn it, we have to do so much. And then I can be like, yeah, that's the minimum. Okay. Are there questions concerning the face-to-face? I will send it around again in an email, in written form, and later on I will give you also more specifications, like what is the format. So in the end, I want it to be square. It is okay if it is just 500 by 500 pixels because of render times. But within these 500 by 500 pixels, it should look nice and not grainy and stuff. But I repeat that later on as well. Okay. Then that would be it for today. Have a nice, well, Sunday. And see you next week.